Welcome, everyone. Really want to welcome you to the second session of Policing, Dialogue, and Community. Thank you for joining us. My name is Taiwo Afolabi. I'm a Canada Researcher in Socially Engaged Theatre and the Director of the Center for Socially Engaged Theatre here at the University of Regina. I'm also an Assistant Professor in the Department of Theatre. And it's really an amazing opportunity to be hosting this and really having this conversation with all of you today. Although we're organizing this event virtually, we'd like to acknowledge the university and of course the center that they are situated on the territories of the Nahiyawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis, Mischief Nation. The University of Regina is on Treaty 4 lands, and with a presence in Treaty 6. For me, land acknowledgement is a reminder of our shared histories, memories, systemic realities, and the intricate collective action towards change, towards equity. While our dialogue focuses on policing in Canada, particularly Saskatchewan and of course the prairies, I am also reminded that this discourse is relevant across the world, including my country of birth, Nigeria, and of course, elsewhere in the world. With that, I'd like to also acknowledge two of my PhD students that have been working with me on this, Luba Kozak and Ibukunlua Fason. Just wanted them to just talk a little bit about their work before we proceed. Over to you, Luba.
Thank you so much, Dr. Afolabi, Taiwo, for including me in the organization of this project. And thank you to all of our incredible panel speakers for sharing your time and insights today. My name is Luba Kozak, and I am a graduate research assistant at CSET, where I serve as a communications and research projects manager. I am a first-year PhD student in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Regina, affiliated with the University of Sapienza, Rome, and I am supervised by Dr. Randall Rogers and Dr. Francesco Fredolini. I am a classically trained art historian, researcher, internationally published scholar, and an animal rights liberation activist. My doctoral research is about rethinking human-animal relations through representations of exotic pet animals in 18th century British portraiture, investigating early origins of species politics through post-colonial and post-humanist frameworks to offer an ethical study of the historical animal. As a Ukrainian, I just wanted to take a brief moment to acknowledge the bravery and courage of Ukrainians fighting for our freedom and for democracy as a result of Russia's horrific war in Ukraine. Slava Ukraini. And Ibukun?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bukunlua Fason. I'm a playwright, producer, stage manager, graphic artist, and researcher. As a playwright, I was selected as one of the 5 African theatre producers to participate in the Pan-African Creative Exchange Producers Lab in South Africa and the Playwrights Virtual Lab between 6 early career writers from Nigeria and Wales. As a scholar, my research interest lies in site-specific theatre, a spectatorship space, decolonization, cultural policy, and creative economy. I have published peer-reviewed articles on site-specific theatre in Nigeria, including a co-authored book on cultural and creative arts for students in Nigeria from Basic 7 to 9. I'm currently undertaking my doctoral research in media and artistic research at the University of Regina, Canada, and as part of my doctoral research, I aim to develop an intercultural spectatorship and spatial framework that draws on decolonizing performance aesthetics in multicultural Canadian and transcultural Nigerian theatre practices. I'm the founder and artistic director of Eclectic Theatre, which is a theatre company that focuses on socio-political works, and I'm also a graduate research assistant at CSET. Thank you very much, and over to Dr. Taiwo.
Thank you so much, Luba and Ibukun. I just wanted to say that for me, these are spaces for grad students to speak about their work. So so thank you for bringing the amazing work you're doing to us here at the University of Regina, and of course to us here on the prairies and in Canada. Before we proceed, because I will still introduce our guest today, I'd like just to cover some house rules. We're dedicated to making this space safe and also courageous, where everyone's opinion and experience is valid and equally important. So while we hope to engage in a lively conversation and strongly encourage dialogue, a valuable tool for navigating sensitive topics, I really wish to remind everyone, both our speakers, our guests, and of course our participants who might be asking questions or speaking later on, that we want us hopefully that we can be respectful listeners and mindful in our responses. For the purpose of our interaction, we have defined respect as a way of treating and thinking about someone or something. We also encourage our panelists and of course the audience to ask questions, to reflect, and to share in a way that humanizes others, not dehumanize. For our audience, please use the chat box to ask questions, which we will read out and look forward to addressing them. Also, we request the participants put up their video if they are not, since they're not, if they're not speaking. And then there is closed captioning. So if you want to enable that, just click on the live transcript option and just enable it on your end. And we also have ASL interpretation for those that need it. And of course, for those that will be taking a look at this video later. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge our community partners on this project. Of course, the Regional Police Service, Chief Evan Bray and his team. They've gone over and beyond to help us in connecting us to resources and communities across the province, and of course, even across the region. We're deeply grateful for that. This kind of research and this kind of work that we're doing, it's very sensitive. It also can be time consuming. It can be very evolving. And so having community partners really very, very important. And finally, thank you to our panelists today. We have Deputy Mayor Marcus Chambers, Deputy Chief Laurely Davies, and Nom Leach. We have them today, and it's really, really amazing that the three of them in their busy schedule, they are available to actually for us to have this conversation today. Before I introduce them, I just want to give a quick framing to our session today. I find that framing is always, it can be quite helpful, especially as we think about what we're talking about today. So the title of our conversation today is Community Policing in Canada, Problems and Prospects. I'd like to begin by framing, by acknowledging the sensitivity of the topic, and of course the vulnerability of participants, and of course the panelists. It's very interesting that each time issues around policing is brought up, there is always fresh examples, either from our neighbor country or even in our own country here in Canada and other parts of the world. So that brings that sense of immediacy, that sense of currency to us, that we're constantly living, it's like it never ends. And depending on how we identify, our race, gender, and all of those realities, some of these happenings stick closer to us than others. If there's one thing that I've learned in my engagement in over a dozen countries across 4 continents, is really the need to practice that deep listening and dialogue. And I'm hoping that this is also going to get us there as part of that way to do that. We're also reminded that we're in relation to one another. So it's really important that we breathe to offer positive spaces for others to breathe as well. The term community, which is critical, we're going to be using that term over and over again, because obviously in policing, studies around policing and all that, community policing is a huge, component of that. And I know that Deputy Chief Laurely Davies will speak more to that. Obviously, the word community also has become a buzzword, especially for us within the academia, in research. It's like we're doing community engagement, community participation, community consultation. So it's become a buzzword. It also means different things to different people. From a race standpoint, from a gender standpoint, from equity deserving communities, the word community means different things to different people, whether the digital realm or the in person, it just means so many things. So from identity to physical to geographical or virtual space practice. However, the notion of community can also create a sense of us and them, right? Like this is us and look at them over there. This is my community, all right? And we're trying to untangle all of these things as we explore this this evening about community policing. The goal of this episode is to for us to better understand the notion of community policing as it affects two angles. One, both the police force and the public, because there is an interaction there. Policing for who? By whom? With whom? How? When? Where? These are detailed, ideas that if we can tease them out and go deeper, we can start unpacking the realities around what this means for us, not just only in terms of Regina or Saskatchewan or Western Canada or Manitoba, but really for us here in Canada and of course beyond. So since community policing is a philosophy that promotes organizational strategies that support the systemic use of partnerships and problem-solving techniques to proactively address the immediate conditions for public safety, it is therefore important to investigate ways to better engage community policing. In what ways can we leverage community partnerships, problem-solving and organizational transformation in community policing? What does community policing even mean to us? What does it mean to the police force? What does it mean to the public? All right. What does it mean to the Indigenous community? What does it mean to BIPOC communities? All right. And in fact, who is the community we're talking about here? And what does inclusion, respect, and all of these community-centered ideas around policing looks like? I'll leave my framing at that. I think I've kind of spilled so many things. I can see the three of our panelists, they're nodding their heads and smiling already. We're in for a lot of conversation in this evening. Without further ado, I'd like to just quickly introduce our panelists. I'll start with Nom Leach. Nom Leach is the Executive Director of Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center. It's one of the 11 community policing centers in British Columbia, in Canada, I believe. In Vancouver. And now, of course, I know Nom is going to speak more to the kind of work that he does there. Nom has been the Executive Director for the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center since May 2016. And is a frequent speaker, facilitator, storyteller about the experience of Indigenous peoples in Canada. He was born and grew up in East Vancouver, but his ancestry is from, I will allow him to pronounce those names by himself. My apologies so that I don't massacre that. But his nation, where he also served as chief and then administrator when he lived there. One thing we've also done with the bios of our guests is that we put all of them on our website so that you can read extensively. They have extensive experience around this conversation. He's trained in facilitation with the Canadian Human Rights Foundation, now Equitas, and with Stalmic Restorative Justice in Iloit. Nom worked with communities across Canada to develop Indigenous governance models and constitutions with the National Center for First Nations Governance. For the organization that Nom works with, Nom facilitates the cultural sessions for the Police Academy and Sheriff's Academy at the Justice Institute. He has been teaching Indigenous tools for living course across Canada and online. ITFL, that's the acronym of that, and is built upon Indigenous focusing oriented therapy, IFOT, which is an Indigenous, body-centered, and land-based approach to trauma. Good to have you, Nom, and thank you really for coming. I'll move on to Deputy Chief Laurely Davies. And it's good to have Laurely the second time. She was with us the first episode, so we're happy to have you back. Thank you so much. Deputy Chief Laurely Davies has lead a 25-year plus career with the Regina Police Service, starting her career in 1996. The Deputy Chief Davies has worked in both the uniform and investigative divisions of the RSP, Laurely has also provided leadership in community-based and human resource sections of the service and has been a member of both the public safety and crisis negotiation teams. She has also led many operational and proactive community engagements. Over the past couple of years, her diverse assignments have spanned managing large-scale protests and labor disputes to providing oversight as a critical incident commander on emergency services calls. Laurely developed and leads a Truth and Reconciliation Committee and strategy for the RSP, driven in many areas, driven in many areas. Laurely is also committed to increasing female membership at the RSP and for policing in this province, especially in the supervisory and leadership roles. You can read more about Laurely on our website. Good to have you. And the last but not the least, Deputy Mayor Marcus Chambers is the city councillor for the new boundary ward of St. Norbert Snare River. Again, my apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly. Please, when we ask the question you're responding, please just make those revisions by yourself. My apologies. Prior to seeking public office, Marcus spent 29 years as a civil servant with the province of Manitoba in a variety of positions, both specifically the last 17 managing the provincial nominee program, which brings skilled workers and business investment to Manitoba. Councillor Chambers is the first Afro-Caribbean elected in Manitoba's history in any of the 3 levels of government. Congratulations on that, and also speaks to hopefully how Canada is evolving, in my humble opinion. As an avid community volunteer, Marcus has sat 6 years on the board of trustees for the United Way of Winnipeg and 10 years on the Capital Campaign Cabinet for the Friends of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. I jump down to say that Marcus currently chairs the following boards of standing policy committees: the Winnipeg Police Board, Standing Policy Committee of Innovation and Economic Development, Human Rights Committee of Council as the Vice Chair, and of course the City Council Governance Committee. Good to have the 3 of you. And I have to take my time to read that because, again, some of these topics are very sensitive that we want whoever that is listening later to know that, we're not just, that these are, some of these thoughts are, the kind of to lay the background in some of the work that you've done. So good to have the 3 of you. I'll jump right into it. So the way we kind of structure this is that we have the general prompt that the 3 of you would, respond to, and maybe we just take that in that order that I did introduce you. So the first question that I'd like the 3 of you to respond to is that from your own positionality and perspective, we'd like you to speak to your experience of community policing in Canada, particularly from the philosophical, strategic, and tactic and organizational perspective. That's the first prompt that we'd like you to respond to. And maybe we can do it in that order that I introduced the 3 of you, if that's okay. So we'll start with Nom. Over to you.
Well, we take it from a perspective of some of the most recently colonized people on this planet. The first explorer through here was Simon Fraser in 1808, which was barely 200 years ago. Colonization is recent for us. We have not fully accepted it. So from that perspective, all of these laws, all of these systems, all of these colonized laws and systems were not ours. We didn't write any of these laws. We didn't create any of these systems. We had ways and systems that worked perfectly well for 15,000 years before contact. And in that time, the land was actually better than new when the explorers arrived. So we have a 15,000-year track record of sustainable, successful, healthy living on these lands. And we have tried colonization. We have tried and tried and tried in these legal systems, these so-called justice systems. I refuse to call it a justice system any longer. And they haven't worked. We lead in almost every negative social health indicator that exists, that is measured in Canada. The challenge would be to find one that we don't lead as Indigenous people. So it is an uphill battle to present that alternative idea that colonized systems are not the best. We know, we still remember a time before colonization that was much, much better, not only for us, but for the land, for everything. We also know that colonization was not invented here. It was perfected here. It has thousands of years of practice before it got here. And I would say to each of you, if you go back far enough in your family history, you will find many of the same traumas that we experienced, whether it's war or pandemic or colonization. And there was a time before that for your ancestors, and it may have been better as well. And you just may not have remember that or have memories like we still do of those times. So the challenge is to say, is this truly a justice system? Because it was never designed or intended to provide justice for Indigenous people in this country. From our perspective, it was designed and intended to advance and complete colonization. And in that respect, and in that purpose, it is doing its job perfectly well every second of every day. And the greatest obstacle to that goal is us. So that's an entirely different perspective and viewpoint of justice and policing and law enforcement. But it's something that we think, and we've actually been quite successful in introducing and engaging and facilitating those conversations here in Vancouver for the past 2 years. So we hope to extend and magnify and multiply those conversations here as well. Thanks.
Thank you. We're going to come back. I'm going to ask you a question around what are those things that you're doing already in Vancouver, because I think that might be, sorts of ideas for us also as we think about some of this. I want to go to Laurely. You as an officer, what does, when you think of community policing from your perspective on all those 4 levels, what's your take on that? And what's the textbook idea of what it's meant to be? And of course, and the real idea of what it is.
For sure. Thank you. I think in the textbook, one of the first things you ever learn when you go to police college is Sir Robert Peale's principles of community policing. And it's the public is the police are the public. I appreciate those are based in England. And so if we're talking about colonialism, then, clearly that's where they're based upon. But I think there are some key points in there about you have to have trust between the public and the police. And that really, if you don't have that, then you cannot have community policing. And so, I think from a service perspective, certainly here in Regina, and I know in many places across the country, is really about how do we create trust? How do we gain trust? How do we increase trust with the community? And, as mentioned earlier, Canada is certainly becoming a more diverse community. Regina is definitely in the same boat as that. And so, we really have to be mindful and to think about how can we create relationships with diverse communities in Regina and across the country for sure. And I know that we'll talk sort of about things that we think that we're doing that is setting us on the right path, but it really does have to be about developing that trust, that consultation. It can't be reaching out to communities in a time of crisis to say, no, we have the answer. I mean, we don't. And I think especially in the last, well, I don't know if it's because I'm in a position now where I think more about it, or if it's been that way in terms of the service, but there really has to be an acknowledgement, as Mr. Leach indicated, that policing in Canada is based on a colonial system, and that in itself creates systemic racism within our organizations. And so I think we always have to be mindful of that at the forefront, acknowledge that, and then figure out how we can make a better space for everybody in the community. So I guess that's the challenge ahead for sure. And yeah, I would certainly love to hear about what is happening in Vancouver and some of the initiatives that they're working on to do that.
Thank you, Laurely. I want to come to Marcus. I know that you're on the Winnipeg Police Board, so I'm always excited to not just speak to officers alone or to community members, but to those that are on the board, because that's also very critical. And of course, the fact that your work kind of also focuses to some degree on policy and governance. What's your take on this question around community policing? Again, in Canada, but on those 4 levels: philosophical, strategic, tactic, and organization perspective.
Well, thank you very much for this conversation this afternoon. I'm always excited to be in the company of such luminaries like yourself. I do wish to start by acknowledging that where I am, I'm on Treaty 1 territory, ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota people, the birthplace of the Red River Métis Nation. And the water that we drink is sourced from Shoal Lake 40, which is in Treaty 3. It's a very good question with respect to community policing, because we do have to reimagine community safety and well-being, which involves our police. It is about the partnerships that are necessary to keep our community safe, recognizing that police have been here for hundreds of years. And again, this conversation started, to talk about colonialism, and to Laurely's points of Robert Peale, the modern day architect of policing. Conceptually, when we look at community policing, it is about the partnerships that we need to build to allow for trust and confidence to be reestablished in policing and with the community. In Winnipeg, in our school systems, we had or have community school resource officers that help build relationships between kids, whether they're in elementary schools or middle schools or in high schools. We've seen an erosion of that because while it has been somewhat effective in the schools to build those relationships, when the kids get out on the streets and are in their own neighborhoods and communities, it's not the same officers. So there's not the same level of trust and confidence that has been established in the school as opposed to into the community. There's a ton of reasons why there is that breakdown of trust and confidence in policing. Obviously, internally within policing, there has to be, and our chief has acknowledged the fact that racism exists within policing, as it exists in every institution. Part of dealing with that is looking at what is the complement look like? Is it reflective of the community it's serving? So we've challenged our service to look at the hiring of a more diverse community in policing to reflect the community that it's serving, and to provide throughout their lived experience, how that could better inform the training of other officers that will deliver those services back to the community. It can't all be about policing though. Certainly the community has to play a role in part in identifying what their needs are as we go forward, and how then boards like mine articulate that back to the service so that we can design a strategic plan and a business plan to operationalize the needs of the community. Community policing is not a new concept, but it's certainly something that we have to look at reimagining as our communities become much, much, much more diverse, largely through immigration, as well as the complexity of needs in our community. We look at police that are being called to attend to, mental health crisis, poverty issues, addictions, mental health, homelessness? And are they adequately trained to deal with those community issues? And should they be the ones that are responding to those calls for service? Or should we have other agencies that respond to those citizens that are in crisis to have a better outcome? We see and there was reference about the United States earlier. And I've always said even though we are a different society, I've always said that when the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold. And so we see a lot of what is happening in the United States, and especially here in Winnipeg, we had a convoy that occupied our legislature for 3 weeks during the pandemic in February. But there were underlying tones there of racism that existed in that as well, as well in Ottawa and what we saw in Coutts, Alberta. So these are the things that, again, we have to work together collaboratively as a community of police to work together against, to eradicate in our country, in our provinces, in our cities, and in our communities. So it's going to take collaborative work. It's going to take collaborative effort. It's going to take outside the box type of thinking. But essentially, police have been here for hundreds of years. If they're part of the problem, as many of the abolitionists and the defund groups say, they have to be part of the solution in terms of how we turn this around and evolve policing to reflect the current day composition of our communities.
Well, thank you so much. What I'm hearing, the three of you, kind of that idea of bringing our community back into policing, and that idea of community is understanding what has happened to us before in terms of colonization and where we are, racism and all of those things. But at the heart of that is that idea of, relationship building, trust and confidence in policing, providing service that are forward facing, community centered. So I want to come back to that question around. So, again, we'll start with Norm here. How effective then is community policing? And what are the challenges and the potential outcomes around that? Now, I know that you're doing fantastic work, in Vancouver, which we'll love to hear about, and in your community, and particularly because your community is a culture, is not necessarily, it's a culture-based community. So what, from your own perspective, then what needs to change in policing, which you talked about that a little bit earlier on, but then what are those, how effective is community policing, or how have you re-emerging? Because just to borrow, Marcus' words now, how have you re-emerging community policing, in your work in Vancouver?
We have to examine the definitions of policing. Police is law enforcement, and it enforces laws, not written by us, not in our languages, not according to our worldview, but laws that were written by old, colonized, wealthy men somewhere else. No one in this room wrote any of those laws, and yet they're imposed on us. So, and what is the definition of justice? The Canadian justice system is based on a system of crime and punishment, which is based on a biblical system of sin and penitence, which is derived from the Old Testament of the Bible, not even the New Testament, but the Old Testament. And it does not reflect our version of justice, which is based on healing and balance and relationship. So how do we reconcile those things? It's not possible. If we talk about relationship and trust, well, the relationship between Indigenous people and police in this country began with the Northwest Mounted Police, and their job and their purpose was to police the frontier, which is us. And they did that. And they still do that now as the RCMP. Is that justice? Well, the residential school systems affected every single family, Indigenous family in this country, and is now recognized as an injustice. But we know it affected every single family in this country because it was the law. Can those realities be reconciled?
Thanks, Tom. Before I go to Laurely, how have you, so in your community in Vancouver, how have you reimagined community policing? Or maybe you don't even use that term at all. How do you go about that? I'm kind of really interested in knowing that. How have you gone about creating that sense of community safety and well-being and healing? You know, just to use your words now, you know, how have you been doing that?
Well, it's awareness, it's conversation, it's creating a framework where we can have these difficult conversations in a safe way so that people do not have to become defensive. They do not have to defend, they do not feel threatened, that they can re-examine some of the underlying foundational values and principles that these colonized systems were built on, and people's careers were built on, and their lives have been built on, but we are able to create a safe enough space so we can have the conversation to have another look at them.
Thank you so much. We're still going to come back to that idea of creating safe and courageous spaces, because I know that that's something that I know that at the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center, it's really critical to your programming. I'm gonna come back to that. I want to go to Laurely here. How effective, you know, now that you're in leadership, and part of what you're doing is also to amplify voices, particularly of female voices in supervisory and leadership, positions. So you're not just, you've been on the field, and at the same time, you're in that leadership role now. How effective is community policing, and what are the challenges as an officer? What are the challenges that, and of course the potential outcomes that community policing poses for you, for the police force, obviously, and of course for the public?
Sure, thank you. Well, I think that Deputy Mayor Marcus made a good point when he was talking about school resource officers. Not just one good point. I mean, he made a bunch of good points, but I just want to illustrate this one. Is that in creating relationships with specific officers, we have a cultural and community diversity unit that does great outreach to newcomers to our city, explaining the laws, talking about the role of police. We have a community engagement unit that does that same sort of thing. They're out at preschools, they're meeting, with stakeholders, and they are police officers who are experts at the soft skills in terms of creating relationships, dialogue. It's when you're answering a 911 call at 2 a.m. that, those officers might not have those same soft skills, or because they are dealing with an emergency, they are thinking about weapons, the threat of violence, de-escalating the crisis. And so, when you think about policing, those two instances are almost at odds with one another in terms of, how we want to create those relationships. However, it is almost a necessary evil. If you are responding to an emergency, there are certain things in terms of the crisis that you need to deal with. So I think, for us, it's really educating officers around cultural competency, understanding that if they're going to a call, to ask somebody, for instance, for an Indigenous person, to say, what is your home community, to display some cultural competency, after sort of the crisis is de-escalated, is there someone I can call? Is there an elder in your community who might be an asset? And so I think for us, it's really creating that cultural competency among our officers to understand that when we are dealing with communities who, unfortunately, because of the system that we're in, do come in conflict with officers more often than they should, for sure, that they are able to act with compassion and empathy and cultural competency. And I think the other thing that was mentioned, obviously, is as a police service, when we are more representative of our community, everyone benefits. And so really for us to put a huge lens on our hiring practices. Are there things that we should or shouldn't be doing in terms to so that we are representative of our community, that we are inviting to Indigenous folks, to BIPOC folks, so that we not only are representative of the community, you know, facing outwards, but that education happens inside our organization in terms of, you know, examining our practices, or are there things that we can be doing differently, our training. It really, you know, is, you know, a 100% change once you are representative of a diverse community. And so I think that that is really where we need to go if we're talking about community policing, is to be representative of our community. And I think the other part, obviously, is, as Mr. Leach mentioned, is to create spaces for dialogue outside of crisis times, having safe spaces. We've had an elders advisory council for about 20 years. And so we take advice, we ask for advice, we, you know, try and understand what we may be doing well and what we need to improve upon. But I think that is the key. We're starting a new strategic plan process for the next 4 years. And so we want to ensure that we have safe spaces for dialogue with all diverse members of our community, so that our plan going forward for the next 4 years is what everybody in the community envisions, and not sort of the, you know, what mainstream, you know, white colonial society would envision us to be for a police service. And so we just really have to ensure that we're making that a priority going forward.
Well, thank you. It's really interesting that, you know, you're considering community consultation for your strategic plan planning. That's really great. And hopefully we might come to that, because I was going to ask you a question around de-escalation and community policing, and on and around. I want to come to Marcus. I'm always going back to you around policy and governance, because again, you're the, you know, we have you with us, right? And we have to ask you these questions in terms of what's the you know, how does policy how can policy make community policing effective? That if it's effective at all. And how I know
and it's a,
go ahead, please.
yeah, excellent question, and it's something I probably should have alluded to in my first round of sharing, is that, you know, we have to look at the policies that are out there, the systemic policies that have for far too long marginalized individuals from racial communities. You know, whether it's policies around profiling or carding that, you know, a lot of agencies don't exist but still practice. You know, the promotion policies as well internally, to ensure that, again, people with lived experience are not only being hired, but are also being promoted through the ranks to share their lived experience that can help influence some of the policies that are being created and implemented. You know, I was fortunate to grow up with Devon Clunas, who became Winnipeg's first Black police chief. As a matter of fact, the first Black police chief in Canada of a major Canadian city. I have many friends that are that look like me, that are either current serving members or retired members, and know them to be very good people and have the greatest intent to serve the community. But it is a lot of the historic and systemic policies that that do need to be updated or thrown away and reimagined, so that, you know, whether it's systemically or institutionally, you know, these practices don't exist, and whatever policies are enacted are reflective of the community that is trying to serve. The restorative justice programs, the diversion programs, all of those things, as Mr. Leach has indicated, that speak more to healing than it does a punitive approach to the criminal justice system. Now, there are some people out there that are bent on being, you know, criminals and you know, contributing to the moral destruction of our communities and our societies. But for those that are, part of a system that they had no control in, and I talk about root cause of crime, poverty, addictions, mental health. Those are the people that, again, we should be looking at different policies and different ways of addressing, their issues to get a different outcome and to reduce the burden on our justice system, including our penal systems. And again, if we're talking about healing and even upstream in terms of having programs that will help address young people feel included in our communities. A lot of the kids that are joining gangs today are doing so because they don't feel included in our community and don't see a path forward. So again, it's the policies that we have to look at that have marginalized people for far too long, that we have to start reimagining and looking at differently to welcome individuals in our community that haven't felt included in the past.
Well, thank you so much, Marcus, because you've raised these, this piece around policy that I think it's very, critical, to rethinking and reimagine policing entirely. And I know that Laurely did mention the strategic plan, but we also know that all of these things go hand in hand. So I want to come back to Norm. In terms of, I know that based on your bio that we have, and of course some of the things that we've been opportunity to see and read about with the Vancouver with the Vancouver Aboriginal Community Policing Center. I'd like you to just cite maybe some of those initiatives that that in a way has provided that opportunity to rethink and to reimagine community policing. And perhaps, some of those things, as Marcus did mention, in what ways are you doing that, at your center?
Well, we've recognized that the roots of the challenges of conflict with the law are in things like poverty and trauma and drugs, but it ends up that they are all related to trauma. So we have really delved deeply into trauma training and trauma approaches. And I have to say that I do not like trauma informed. Trauma informed is not enough. To be informed about trauma is to know a little bit, to think that you know something. You need trauma training. You need trauma infusion. You need trauma immersion to understand how trauma is everywhere. And it is the root cause of so many of these behaviors that end up in conflict with the law. But then you just quickly realize that the greatest source of human trauma in human history is colonization. And then you start to see it everywhere. And then you start to look into your own family history and you see what has colonization wrought on your ancestors in other parts of the world, in far past centuries. And it is vast, right? We talk about community safety. Well, is there a community that is safe for women now? I don't know of it. Is policing safe for women? Well, certainly not if you read the headlines about the RCMP. And we see all of that as part of colonization because we did not have those things before. Our communities were safe for women. So we need to start looking at the underlying foundational assumptions and presumptions and values and principles of these colonized systems and say and ask, is it reasonable to expect colonized systems to provide the solutions for the problems that were caused by colonized systems? So we want to have the conversation to say, well, let's have a look at the ways of Indigenous peoples and compare them to the colonized systems that have replaced them over the past 500 years here. And if we want to, let's go back to the other indigenous peoples around the world and say, did you have systems before colonization that worked better? And let's understand the differences and the underlying root causes of those differences and have that conversation.
Thank you, Nom. I'm still gonna once we hit 4 o'clock, I'm gonna open the space for questions from our participants who may have questions. But I'm still gonna come back. Hopefully, we'll have time to come back to, I guess, in terms of specific programming that you think that we can take a look at, because I think that those specificity can also help us in thinking and kind of imagining what are those things that are existing already that you're working around. So hopefully I'll come back to that. Maybe you can just kind of help us think around that. I want to come to Laurely. I know that last time there were a lot of questions around curriculum. And it seems as if our participants kind of had a meeting. We're going to ask questions about curriculum today, and they were just pumping questions around curriculum. I wanted to come to that, particularly as it affects de-escalation within the context of community policing. From your own experience, what existed in curriculum that offer us the opportunity to have an idea of what that looks like within the context of community policing? How would that look like, or how does that look like?
For sure. So I can't give specifics in terms of hours of instruction or anything along those lines, but back when I went through training a number of years back, it was called verbal judo, which still sort of seems to have a physical side to it. But it was really around, being able to essentially de-escalate a crisis. So, what types of things can you do in terms of, being calm yourself, lowering your voice, talking, slowly, and just really sort of around that. I guess crisis communication is essentially where it was aimed at, in terms of hopefully just by talking, you can try to calm down a situation. And, I don't want to presume, but I think by nature, women tend to do that a little better than men in many circumstances. And so, I think there was still value in the training, but, a lot of it to me seemed like common sense. But, in terms of even the sort of the national use of force model, everything at the beginning is just about de-escalation, right? Trying to calm the situation by using your communication skills before you, try to before you have to sort of escalate to sort of the next level of force. And so it is a big component in terms of what we try to educate our officers with. And certainly, I think that cultural competency piece is a very big part of it. It needs to go hand in hand in understanding diverse communities and differences in culture and language, and being respectful to that. And so I think that as well is a big part of it. And so, I think de-escalation is, sort of a buzzword, but it's something that was happening long before I was at police training. But there certainly is an emphasis on it. We want to ensure that our officers do have those soft skills that, the vast majority of situations can be resolved through communication and not sort of any escalation of use of force. Not every, but certainly there are some situations that just because of the nature of the crisis, it's not possible. But, I think from the chair that I sit in now, certainly that's something that we want to continue to ensure that our officers always have education on, and not even out in the community, but respectful conversations in the workplace, right? Dealing with conflict, being respectful, that type of training needs to occur all the time, just to ensure that we're serving the community to the best of our abilities, for sure.
Thank you. Marcus, I want to come back to you. It's interesting that you sit both on the Winnipeg Police Board and the Human Rights Commission of Council. That's interesting because tying that together from a human right perspective, it's not contradictory. It's complementary. It can be complementary, and although at the same time there's a tension there. I guess my question for you is, in your work around, with the board, how do you center or recenter human right?
Excellent question, and it's not without its challenges. Winnipeg is a human rights city. We have the Canadian Museum for Human Rights here. We're also a safe city. We joined the UN Safe Cities Initiative. So there's a lot of work to be done, and largely the work that we're doing on the Human Rights Committee of Council is recognizing our pathway towards reconciliation, as well as making Winnipeg a more inclusive community, equitable and inclusive community. Since being elected, and I mentioned that, or you mentioned in my bio, I'm the first Black elected official in the province's history. I was elected in 2018. Prior to me, there was no Black city councillor. I was appointed deputy mayor. Since my election in 2018 and 2019, we elected 3 members of the Manitoba legislature that are Black, and we're still waiting to elect a Black member of parliament to Ottawa. But again, the work that we're doing on the Human Rights Committee of Council is to find ways to ensure, again, that our city services are reflective of the community that it serves. In policing, this is one of the things that our board has provided as a challenge to the service as one of our 4 pillars in our strategic plan. We also believe it impacts the health and welfare of the organization itself, the well-being of the organization, in terms of having that diversity lens applied to it. And again, increasing the amount of hires that we have from diverse backgrounds, including, culturally, including, religion. So whether you're Sikh or Muslim, and from the LGBTQ plus, I think I messed that up, but LGBTQ2 plus community, to ensure that there's representation and that lived experience that can better go into the training of our officers. I also believe that we need to standardize the training across jurisdictions as well. And I think there's a big call to standardize training. Of course, the RCMP go to RCMP College in Regina. But here in our province, we have, I believe it's 12 different agencies that administer policing under the Police Services Act here in Manitoba. But the training for each of those agencies is different from agency to agency. Winnipeg has about 1,400 sworn members, the city of Brandon less so, and then the smaller jurisdictions even less. And so the training that goes into those agencies, whether it's tactical, whether it's community-based, or traffic, or what have you, all of those agencies are trained different. In the Winnipeg Police Service uses CALIA for its accreditation, the Canadian Association of Law Enforcement agency that helps to make sure that our systems and our training is at par, so that Crowns can receive the information for charges to be laid or prosecution, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the training that goes into our agencies or our police has to be standardized to ensure that it's effective. In our strategic plan, we talk about adequate and effective service. I don't know that we have a good definition of what that all entails. But we also have to look at how it meets the expectations of the citizens that where we're delivering those services. And of course, expectations increase exponentially. Here in the city of Winnipeg, we're also known as Pothole City, in terms of our roads. And the one thing that I get from, in terms of representing the residents in my ward, I pay taxes. Where are those taxes going to if our roads are in such a bad state? In terms of policing, when a call for service is requested through 911 services, and that service is dispatched, what is a reasonable expectation for response time? So again, a lot of that is around what are the resources available to police in terms of our budgets that we can send out cars to respond to that call for service in a reasonable time. Is 2 hours a reasonable time for police to respond to a person in a case of emergency, defining what that emergency is. So again, there's a lot that we have to unpack in terms of how we go forward in presenting those services. Again, there was some discussion around use of force and de-escalation. How do we train individuals around that? And again, the types and complexity of the calls that they're responding to, dealing with mental health, addictions. In Winnipeg, we have started the ART program, which is the alternative response to citizens in crisis, that pairs a police officer with a clinician, including a mental health worker or a social worker or a crisis worker or a community service worker to address the specific concerns of that individual. And sometimes individuals are triggered by a person in a uniform, but having a person that is in plain clothes that has the training that can deal with that specific crisis, I think we'll have a better outcome for citizens and better address adequate and effective service.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to, before I come back to question, my other, maybe second to the last round of questions, our guests, our participants, anybody with any question, I'm going to check the chat box. I don't have anything here, but if there's any question that you have, please just pop it up. We'll be happy to read that out loud for our guests to speak to them. I want to come back to training because I hear that Laurely and Marcus, both of you emphasize training, and yes, it's very critical. And the kind of training and who is doing the training, the resources, the materials, and all of those things. The looking at all of the what are the contents. So what is the content of the training itself, right? Those are really critical pieces. I want to use that as a springboard to go back to Norm, because I know that you're part of what you facilitate cultural sessions and training for Police Academy and Sheriff's Academy at the Justice Institute. And you've also been teaching Indigenous tools for living across Canada and online. And also you have built upon Indigenous focusing oriented therapy. Do you want us to tell us, I don't know what I've never experienced any of those sessions, but it speaks to training and your effort at the center, your organization, what that looks like, and how ways that can help us when it comes to rethinking public safety, policing, and all of that.
Well, consider the objective, the goal of Police Academy is to churn out police officers trained in a standard way to be and behave exactly like police officers, and it doesn't change a lot year over year over year over year, because it's based on the standard principles and understanding and definitions of what is justice in this country. It's based on a colonized, whose language is it? It's not ours. Whose system of laws is it? It's not ours. Whose values and morals and moral systems is it based on? Not ours. And who wrote those laws? Not us. Law enforcement is just one aspect, one piece, one bit of of the justice system. The police don't write those laws. They don't rule on those laws. They don't administer the punishments doled out by that system. So when are we going to have the conversation about what are they really learning? So what we try to introduce is the concept of, from an Indigenous perspective, what does it mean to be a good human being first? And then how do you administer justice from that perspective? And it's not just about the law, it's deeper than that. And also the understanding that there have been and there still are unjust laws in this country. When Indigenous people hear the words rule of law, and I think many people of color or people who are poor or even women hear those words, they know that an unjust law is about to be imposed and enforced on them. And police is that arm, that's their job in this system, is to enforce those laws and not to question them. So it's the whole thing, and nobody argues that the justice system is perfect and works great and it doesn't need any reform. Everybody agrees that it needs reform at multiple levels, all over. They just disagree on where it should start. So we just say, let's look at the foundations of the whole thing and think, if it was up to us here, today, now, if we were to design a system that was more fair, more just, more equitable, would it keep all those laws, or could we do better by starting over? Can we have that conversation?
Thank you. Thank you. You've spoken to those levels of the philosophy that guides the course itself or the program itself, and how that then in many ways shape, the strategy around it, the tactic around it, the content itself, and of course what the organization really focuses on in really engaging those content and those ideas to community. Thank you for sharing that. There's a question here on that I will come back to after this round. I want Laurely, I was wondering if you can, based on this issue around training and the escalation, what are those things that the Regina Police Service is actually doing, or those programs that maybe they are yet to launch them, or yet they're thinking about them, or perhaps even those ideas might even inform the strategic plan that hopefully will be developed?
For sure. So I think over the last number of years, we've been, really placing a focus on how we can educate our officers around cultural competency, about the history of the system that we're in, about colonialism. And so, over the last probably, I would say for sure, 6 to 8 years, in our annual training, we have what's called block training for 1 week. You're pulled off of your regular duties, no matter where you work. And we've really made a focus of having members from diverse communities come in for half a day and provide education, talk about pathways forward, have really good discussions about the calls to action and what does that mean for a police service, and have dialogue and discussion and debate around, what does that mean to you as a police officer? And so we're trying to develop some cultural competencies in that way. And we hope every piece helps. But then as well, it's not just in the classroom training. We host a round dance every year where we invite the community to come out. Our elders, we have a feast. And so not only are we inviting the community, we're educating our members on, those cultural beliefs. And, again, that sort of good dialogue. I sit next to a person from the community. We have discussion in a safe space, so to speak, as we're eating or as we're smudging. And so really creating those opportunities, I think, to understand about different cultures. We've had a number of meetings with members from Black and Sask, and we've had them come in and do some training for our officers to talk about history and the path forward, and to share lived experience, and really shine a light on a human way in terms of what somebody might be thinking when they're pulled over by the police. And so I think the more awareness we can create amongst our officers, provide those opportunities for interactions in a safe space, is really the way forward for us. And I don't think that we have it 100% correct, but I think that we're making some baby steps in the right direction. And yeah, I think we just really need to be open for that. And you mentioned around the stakeholder engagement, but I think we need to invite our community to share with us what they see as opportunities for education and awareness and dialogue. And so, we're not going to have the answer, but people in our communities will, and creating that dialogue and listening and being open to outside the box. And so, I think that's where we need to go and what we're trying to do, for sure.
Thank you, Laurely. Interesting in terms of how gradually this idea of understanding the root cause of the history, the root cause of some of these distress calls, knowing that it's just beyond one person shouting over another, or one person just displaying, maybe an object, of violence and all that, but that there's bigger issues around, around mental health, around poverty, around homelessness, and knowing that these are big issues beyond just policing, that, in many regards and many systems, we've kind of brought everything together, just dump it at the foot of the police, like just deal with all of them. It's interesting that hopefully, gradually, we're beginning to think about that. I know it's taken us a long time to get to go towards that direction. But what's interesting is that that's then helping us to start reframing and rethinking what policing means, or what it can be, and of course, the model that was handed down to us, and how we can change that and all that. I want to come to Marcus, because I know that apart from the fact that you're a public servant, and you serve your community in a very astronomical way, you were referring to some historical realities around representation within the hiring system, in Manitoba when it comes to police. I think my question is, in what ways can that model of hiring representation help shift the thinking again, the culture around policing that we're talking about? And maybe this is like obvious, but I think also it might be interesting to kind of just highlight that in meaningful ways, because there are times that even the proximity in terms of identity of the officer to the situation on ground might actually make a shift, or how they are addressed, or the language that is being spoken, and all of those cultural realities, how that can shift the results of that encounter. I hope that's my round way of coming to that question. I hope it's clear.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and certainly, it's seemingly the solution, to a lot of these issues is around the hiring and the human resource practices around hiring and promotion. But it's also one of the bigger issues, because you can't compel people to apply for positions in policing. One of the things, and we've just promoted the inspector to the rank of superintendent here in the city of Winnipeg. Her name is Bonnie Emerson, and she's Indigenous. And I absolutely love working with her, because she's so forward thinking in terms of how she would like to complement her staff, that report to her, and some of the projects that she wants to initiate in terms of making building bridges within policing and within the community, and of course the trust and confidence that is so necessary now as we're embarking on the 2-year anniversary of the loss of George Floyd on May 25th, recognizing that there was 3,000 pieces of legislation that were passed in the United States in terms of police reforms as a result of George Floyd. But also recognize you can pass as much legislation as you want, and it might not change anything. But what Laurely has talked about in terms of the cultural competencies that need to evolve and need to have greater understanding and training around, those are the things that can actually shift the dial in terms of, again, building that trust and confidence within policing. The promotion process, and I know that that's more of an issue that has been here in Winnipeg anyway, a huge issue in terms of the unions and how that is done. But we need to break away from some of the past practices, and again, reimagine how we do that to ensure that, again, those with lived experience, those that come from cultural backgrounds, and it's not a matter of weakening or compromising on the hiring or the promotion processes, but it's a matter of supporting those individuals that are interested in furthering their career in policing, to ensure that they have access to the programs and the resources that can help propel their careers into decision-making roles that can impact on things like training and education that help build those cultural competencies that are administered in the community. One of the things that, again, in terms of the shift in policies, and I look to the incidents that took place in Alberta, where 2 individuals were shot basically a week apart, that presented with mental health issues. The primary role of policing is to take control of those situations. If there was a policy shift that said if the area was secure and that there was no immediate threat to the individual or the surrounding area, that time can be taken to de-escalate that individual presenting with a mental health issue, then it's a paradigm shift in terms of not just taking charge of that situation or that circumstance, but actually waiting for a better outcome. And again, can that be provided by somebody with the training or experience or cultural competency to deal with that individual, to de-escalate it so that it doesn't become a fatal situation? And those are some of the things that we should be evolving to in better protection of our community and its citizens.
Thank you so much. I won't editorialize what you've said, because I think there's a question here that we have 10 minutes. I want us to get to 2 questions actually. So I'll read it here. So thank you to the organizers, panelists, and participants for making this a highly informative event. The writer, my name is Vibir Natana. I hope I did pronounce that correctly. And I'm joining from Treaty 4 territory in Regina, Saskatchewan. I really appreciated Mr. Leach's comment on the importance of moving beyond the starting point of being trauma-informed to culturally competent in the matters of community policing. While training to this effect is critical, how do panelists see these concepts being enforced in practice and evaluated for long-term effectiveness? As a person engaged in community through study, work, and organizational settings, these questions often arises when seeing recurring issues in communities. So the question is, how do you all see this concept of informed, culturally rather than trauma informed? And I think it was Norm that did mention that, to trauma infusion, trauma training. And how can we enforce this in practice? And how can we then evaluate it for long-term effectiveness? And any of you can take that. I know that that's anyone can take that in no particular order.
Well, I can give it a shot. I think it's an excellent question, and I think if any of my friends here have the answer, I would be happy to hear it. I think that we're sort of trying to take baby steps into cultural competency, trying sort of as many different things as we can in order to create that within our organization. I don't know at this point if there are metrics, how we measure it. I mean, community trust and satisfaction, I suppose, is one way to do that. We have a community satisfaction survey every 2 years. However, how much representation do we have from diverse communities that respond to that survey? So it's probably not a true indicator of everyone in the community in terms of how we're doing. But yeah, it's a good question. I don't know how we measure it, and we look to other organizations for best practices, and I would say I'm not aware personally of anything out there that's been sort of touted as sort of best practice in terms of cultural competency. Although I'm certainly interested in Mr. Leach's training that he provides, and that's perhaps we can have an offline conversation. So that's probably the best I can do. I think it's a work in progress, and we're just starting down that road. But yeah, it's definitely where we need to go moving forward.
Thank you, Laurely. Norman and Marcus, anyone?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Deputy Chief Davies has stated there, and I'm also interested in hearing what Mr. Leach is going to respond to. Don't want to put you on the hot seat, but no, it is really again, if we're looking towards building trust and confidence back into the community of policing, transparency and accountability are two of the metrics that we need to include as key performance indicators that will determine whether or not we're going down the right path. This is something again that I've challenged our chief with to look towards how do we increase that transparency, and I'm not talking about the operational side of it, but anytime instances come up where police are questioned about certain practices, or recently in our news we've had a couple of situations where the actions of an officer have been called into questions, as a matter of fact, leading to charges being laid. And so from that perspective, the public wants to know what happened to that individual, if whether it's an internal investigation through one of our oversight bodies, or if in fact charges are laid and it works its way through the courts. If there is an acquittal, but sometimes internal processes can still work towards getting more of an accounting of what happened. The public does want to know those things, because it does speak to trust and confidence in that police are not policing themselves and sweeping these issues under the rug. I note in some jurisdictions, Toronto and Edmonton, that the lens of accountability is provided through media reports that the public has access to, and that they can see the outcomes of certain investigations that have taken place. And I'm not talking about, if an officer is late to work 3 times a week, or different internal human resource issues that happen from time to time. But I'm talking about the things that the public holds them to that different standard of accountability. We need to increase that transparency and ensure that the public is aware that if there are breaches of codes of conduct, that they will be dealt with, because we do hold police and elected officials to a higher code of standards. So for me, it is about accountability and transparency. And again, not on the operational details, but to ensure that we can trust our police in doing the right thing in terms of the administration of their duties as it relates to our communities and neighborhoods.
Thank you, Marcus. I want to come to Nom with that question, and maybe in your work, maybe you've developed, a way of evaluating this already. Your response to the question now. I think all of us are wanting to hear you.
Well, Vancouver is probably the most progressive police force in the country, and they've probably made the most changes over the past 10 years because of Robert Pickton and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, as well as the Wally Opal inquiry. And they've been under such scrutiny, and they have done a lot. But as it is, so the presentation that we deliver to Police Academy, we get 3 hours out of a year of training. And we've asked for more. Every year we ask for more, and we don't get more, because it has to come from somewhere. So that's one metric. How many actual contact time is there between delivering an Indigenous worldview and an Indigenous perspective on the history and the relationship that Indigenous people have with police to explain why it is that we are not happy when they arrive? Because the relationship is one of fear, suspicion, and hatred because of the history, because it was the men in uniforms who came to enforce those laws that took away our children, that forced us onto reserve, that took our men away to prison. And we get 3 hours, and we've always had 3 hours, and we don't get more. Now they have other training that they get from within their academy, and that's one. So how much time do they actually spend with and in Indigenous communities to understand the actual experience of Indigenous people in this country? And it could extend beyond just Indigenous community. It's communities of color, it's communities of poverty, it's other identifiable communities, even women. We know the statistics. We work with women a great deal. But we also know that fewer than 1 in 10 of sexual assaults gets reported to police, because those women know what's going to happen to them. That's horrible. And that's gone on forever, since before the colonization of Canada. And we know that fewer than 1 in 10 of those reports leads to charges. And fewer than 1 in 10 of those charges leads to convictions. And this is the colonized system of justice that's imposed throughout the world now. And it hasn't fixed that yet. So I don't know how people can defend the system as it is, because everyone agrees that it needs work and it needs fixing and it's not perfect. We just think it's too big a job to get started on right away. And we say, all it is people talking about it. And the more we talk about it, the more we understand some of the harms that it causes, and the understanding and the agreement that we know we can do better. And I don't know what people are afraid of.
Well, thank you so much. No, that's it's really you're taking us again, going back to the systemic realities where we sit on, and how we need to rethink and shift, bring a shift totally. I know we're time, it's 4:30 Saskatchewan time. We want to hold very dearly to our time. But if you can just 2 extra minutes, I just want our panelists to go around just your last thoughts, last words before we bring this to a close this evening. And maybe I'll reverse. I'll start with Laurely, if you want to, your last words around our thoughts, our conversation today, and then we'll go to Norman, and then we'll finish on Marcus.
Thank you. Well, certainly thank you for the conversation. you know, I leave here hopeful, although, you know, I appreciate what Mr. Leach says, is that, you know, I'm working within a system that's a big system that at some point we, you know, needs to be addressed. And you're right, it is daunting, I suppose, maybe overwhelming. You know, I think from the chair I sit in, you know, if we could just continue to make those baby steps in terms of inviting community to problem solve, to have that dialogue in order for us to create that cultural competency. You know, I think that for me, that's important. Yeah, it's given me a pause to reflect, and I thank you for that, because you know, I think that there is a bigger picture that we all need to think about in terms of what our personal responsibility is to creating change and not just dialogue about change. So I thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Now, do you want to talk and then we finish on Marcus?
Yeah, I hear that all the time. Change takes it slow, it's baby steps, it's hard. Either humans are the best able to adapt to change, the most resilient, the smartest, the most gifts to adapt to everything, the weather, the news, the world. Either we're the best at that on this planet or we're not. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say that we're the best at that and then say, oh, but change is hard. You know what? There's many other words for change: growth, progression, advancement, improvement, learning. Those are all synonyms for change. So I don't know why change is suddenly, sometimes we find excuses not to do it because we're supposed to be the best at it. And Indigenous people, nobody has survived more change in the past 500 years than us. And we understand, and everything has changed for us in the past 500 years, everything. And man, we survived, and we're healing. And we think that, man, if we can do it, so can you.
Thank you, Nam. Marcus?
Thank you. I also want to echo the thanks of the other panelists for having this discussion and dialogue today. I think it is, you know, a key thing in terms of what Norm has indicated about change. You know, my challenge to our chief and to our service is a commitment to continuous improvement. And no matter how well you feel we're doing things right now, there's always an opportunity to improve, and recognizing that our cities, our neighborhoods do not look like they did 10, 15, 20 years ago, that we are continually evolving from an ethnocultural standpoint, you know, recognizing our understanding and tolerance around the variety of religions that are now in our society, the openness of our sexuality that is discussed on a daily basis. We need to evolve around a lot of those issues and make sure that our society is inclusive and reflective of all of the diversity that we have. So it's important that our policing standards also change, also evolve, and are also reflective of our modern day society, which also includes you know, the diversity and equity that we need to thrive as a society. Mr. Leach is absolutely correct in asserting that over the last 500 years, the Indigenous community has had to change and evolve here as well. And it's time that, you know, from a colonial perspective, that we also look at decolonizing our education system, our child welfare system, and bringing into scope things of equity and inclusion. So from my perspective, and again, I talked about earlier about the need for greater accountability and transparency. These are all things that we need to look at as we evolve our society, recognizing that you don't turn a big ship in the middle of the ocean for fear of capsizing. It is gradual, you know, but I am hopeful that as we do go forward, that these changes will help improve our standards of policing and our society as a whole.
Thank you so much. And speaking of growth and change and learning, I do also want to acknowledge that, you know, Regina Police Service, the moment I reached out to them, they really embraced us. And I think I mentioned this in the first episode. And this is not trying to, you know, to pat them on the back, not at all. This topic is very challenging. I've had more no's in my entire project in my life in this project than every other one. And that's because of how sensitive it is. So I'm hoping again, on that note, I'm hoping that this is again taking us to that position where we're having this conversation, and hopefully we're not just going to be doing the talk, we're going to be walk the talk. Both at different levels beyond policing. I think these issues that we're talking about, it's like we need to x-ray all our systems as a nation, as a people, as a race, and, you know, as human beings and as a world, and then just turn it around. Because I think, like we said, colonization and all of these things affect every facet of our existence. Our third episode is on the 17th of June. And it's around mental health and policing interventions on the Canadian prairies, implications and impact. So we're going to be having also 3 amazing panelists to come and engage with us. I'm also hoping that, you know, Laurely can follow up with Norm later on back end about the program that they are doing. I think it's really amazing. Again, this is part of what this is all about also, to start engaging how can we use our iron to sharpen one another, for lack of a better you know, simile right now. Anyways, really deeply appreciate everyone for being here tonight, this evening. Thanks to Luber and Ibukun for their help. Thanks to our ASL interpreters, and really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you. Thank you so much, Norm. Thanks so much, Laurely, and thanks so much, Marcus, for helping tonight. Thank you so much.
It should be acknowledged that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which is the annual convention of all of the municipalities across Canada, will be held in Regina, Saskatchewan this year, starting, I believe it's May 31st through to June 5th. So all of the mayors, councillors, CAOs of each city will be converging on Regina this in 2 weeks to talk about municipal issues. And they're the branch that lobbies the federal government for changes. A great opportunity if you're living in the city of Regina to participate in some of these discussions. I know that when I attended in Quebec City, there was a lot of discussion of policing in that that conference as well. So again, another great opportunity to further these discussions.
And I also remember there is the Coalition for Canadian Police Reforms. They're having their first conference from this 14th of June to 16th of June, I believe, and it's virtual. So folks interested can go to, you know, Coalition for Canadian Police Reforms. So I think there are a lot of resources or ideas springing forth. We hope that, you know, like I said, you know, it's taking us towards that direction, and then where we need, you know, we just need speed and urgency to get to that position. Thank you so much, everyone. We deeply appreciate the time you spend with us this evening. Do have a lovely long weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.